Okay, so we did culture yesterday. Now I'm just doing the short little video. And videos on what we did, which was basically this. Just get rid of that. Okay, so this is culture. So we talked about these things here, why learn English, English history, and then types of verbal, non-verbal, paraverbal types of language, language and learning, learning styles, culture and learning, inclusive strategies for dealing with cultural differences that may affect ESL or EAL classrooms. And then why teach English? Well, because 1.5 billion people speak English in the world. Basically the same number as those who speak Mandarin. And we talked about the history. So originally there were the Celtics and then Anglo-Saxons, Romans, Vikings and the French. So we call this the Middle Ages during the Roman and Vikings time. And the French time. And then after the French is when the British started colonising different parts of the world. We call it modern English time. So Old English is way back in the 10th century. Middle English is from the 11th to the 15th century. And then Modern English is after that. So we talked about things that influence English language. Like, for example, there's over 7,000 words brought from France across to English, the English language, over 300 years that the French occupied. Over 500 years of warfare, but 300 years occupying England. And we talked about that a long time ago, 400 AD, what England looked like when it was taken over by the Romans during that time, 400 AD. And we did the history, like the 11th century, what England looked like. So you can see this is all part of the French taking over here, 12th century and 13th century, 15th century, how the writing changed. 16th century, 17th century is pretty much normal. 19th century, more so. And now we have the British and American accents and English spelling, as well as like Singlish for Singapore English and Frenglish for Chinese. And we had a quiz on the history of English language. And these are the answers to the quiz. Then we talked about what culture is. Enables us to get through the day because we and other people encounter and attach somewhat the same meaning to the same things. And the importance of culture, what makes culture, Aboriginal culture, and what a culture clash is. As well as when you suffer from culture shock, we talked about. Now we talked about how culture can be different in different countries. For example, in some countries, they believe more in a God. Therefore, they're up here on this side. This is survival self-expression here. And up this is traditional versus secularism. So up here, Protestant Europe, where they don't really believe in a God. And we talked about Eastern versus Western philosophy. We have the group mentality in the Eastern and striving to do your best independently for the Western. So information about Australia, how roughly 1 in 3 or 4 born overseas with our population, that we allow roughly 14,000 refugees to enter Australia every year, but that's during the Liberal government. Maybe it'll change with the Labor government, which is not a lot. It used to be a lot more, but now up to 14,000. And saying that every culture has these attributes, and talked about high context and low context cultures. So Asians have more non-verbal. We call that high context. So you don't really understand. You need to know the meaning behind the gestures, the cues that they give when they signal something. If they're doing this, it means I'm not sure, for example. But in Western society, it might just be you're scratching your head. So we talked about language and culture, how they're embedded, entwined. Talked about how you can misinterpret colloquialisms, as you can see here with this little joke about Australian colloquialism. We say how are you going, not how are you doing in Australia as well. Accent and dialect, we just mentioned that in different areas we have Well, in Australia we have the Australian accent, but within the Australian accent we have dialects. So the Australian accent probably has maybe 2 or 3 dialects, which I'd say probably would be in the outback in Queensland and probably like South Australia, Melbourne, Victoria. So dialect is within a country. We talked about the dialects that they have in America as well. If it's completely different, we call it an accent, but a dialect, you might misinterpret and say it's an accent, but if you speak American English, that's your accent, but the dialect is different. So it's a bit more broader down here. So like, North Carolina, Oklahoma, down south. And in Japan also they have different dialects. They speak pretty much mainstream in Japanese here and here, but different elsewhere. And in Australia we have an accent too. We say that ER is ah. So river, mother, bother, not bother. We talked about British and American English and how. Next thing is about communication, whether we do verbal or non-verbal. So I might have this section, how do we communicate? How do we communicate? And from here on, I'm talking about that sort of thing. So yes, of course, we talk, but it's not everything because 55% is non-verbal and paraverbal is how we say it. And things like bowing, it's a non-verbal. So non-verbal, example of non-verbal would be to bow. Example of non-verbal is bowing. Okay. Then we talked about how it can be different, how we bow. Like in Thailand, we do this or we do this or we do that. But in Japan, we do that or this or that. It's a bit complicated, so I'm going to delete that one. We talked about other things like, so there's 7 types of non-verbal communication. So you've got proxematics, how close. Haptics is touching. Vocalics is your voice up and down. Your chromemics is how you respect time. Physical environment is just when you talk to someone, how you are in your environment. Kinesics is your tone and speech and your movement that you do. And personal appearance. Okay, so lots of things. So we can see kinesics is that one. That's the body movement. And some things can be misinterpreted, like these things here. So when you talk to someone, this can be misinterpreted. And this here can mean like, bottom, as well as good, as well as money, as well as zero. So types of language is the next section. Actually, we've already done paralanguage, so I'm going to delete that bit too. Prosodic and para. So prosodic is stress intonation, so I might just put that back up here. Okay, so there's 7 types of non-verbal language. Now we're doing types of language. I'm just going to bring that one back up there. So next thing is we'll just call this one facial expressions. So facial expressions we discussed are a lot more important now when we wear masks with COVID as well. So facial expressions show us a lot. And some people might do a poker face where they don't talk very much. Asian people might do that, or they might just smile. But if you smile too much, you can be a bit fake. So we talked about laughing when people are nervous or embarrassed. Might be misconstrued by Westerners as being cheap and shallow. Anyway, so the last bit was how to incorporate this into the classroom. So what we learned here is to make sure that other people understand different people's cultures and work out that gestures might mean different things. Basically just educate, educate, educate. We had the functions of language. So we have there's 6 functions according to Michael Halliday. And there's a quiz here you can do. Or 7 functions it says. Then something from the book is about Ken Willing's strategies to learn. So these are his strategies, things that we can do to learn. Okay. Everyone should be doing. Next bit of the book was about how we learn. So learning styles and differences. So we talked about the VARK, which was made by Fleming. And you've got a VARK question here to do. It's got about what it's all about. We didn't include the reading section though, actually. So I might just put the reading section in here. I'll come back. And then we talked about this Diaz-Maggiore continuum, which is saying what kind of learner you are as well. And then lastly, we talked about David Kolb's learning styles, which just shows us how to learn. And then we talked about Howard Gardner's his multiple intelligences. Yep, and then we talked about just the homework that we had, which is basically to look into which kind of learning style you have. And that was the end of our lesson. Got a few other quizzes here, and then we talked about the assignment, and that was the end of our 3-hour lesson that we had. Okay.